Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your invitation to this distinguished university. I'm delighted to be here, and more than delighted to have the opportunity to discuss with Dr. Habers. We've already discovered we've got a common friend in the sociology of science. Now, I've been asked to talk to you about purpose in an uncertain world. And of course, when you ask someone about purpose, there are two ways you can handle it. You can handle it purely intellectually and philosophically, or you can handle it personally, or you can try to mix them. And I'm going to try to mix them a bit tonight, because I come to you in a sense as unknown. And my main contributions, if they're worth anything on purpose, of course reflect my own experience. And you need to know a little bit about that in order to see exactly where I am coming from. Well, I'm coming from Northern Ireland. That is a story on its own, of course. It's not exactly the best advert for Christianity at all times. My parents were very unusual. They were Christian without being sectarian, and they allowed me to think. Indeed, they encouraged me to think. So my first engagement with the Christian worldview as a child was something that was intellectually invigorating, expansive, knew no limits of exploration. And it was only until much later that I discovered that there were some people, professing Christians, who didn't regard the world like that. My father, I remember when I was 14, handed me the Communist Manifesto and said, "You ought to read this. You ought to know what Marx is saying." So that's the atmosphere I grew up in. And when I went to Cambridge last century, yes, it's true actually, I encountered in my first week something that actually set a compass bearing in my life in terms of its purpose. I went up to read mathematics. Why did I do that? Why did I seek the purpose in doing maths? Well, actually, I wanted to do languages. And then I wanted to do electrical engineering. And then somebody said, well, you might get into Cambridge if you did maths, so I did maths. So the way in which our life's purposes are set often seem to be a little bit arbitrary retrospectively. And when I got there, as I say, in my first week, a student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, I'm so sorry I asked you that. You're Irish. All you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it." Now, I'd heard that before, but somehow I felt this is an important stage in life. I've been brought up with parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents who had absorbed and lived the Christian worldview. Now I was at Cambridge. And now I had a unique opportunity of pursuing what I think is the most important question relating to purpose, and that is a question of truth. I wasn't interested in whether my Christianity was really helpful. I wanted to know how it sat within the field of worldviews, and so I decided to get to know them, not simply theoretically through reading books, but personally through getting to know people who did not share my background, who'd never been to church, and so on and so forth. And I've been doing it ever since, befriending people of alternative worldviews. I got so interested in this. Running through Cambridge, I did mathematics, but I was always interested in where does mathematics sit within science? And where does science fit in within the bigger meta-narrative? Is there a bigger meta-narrative? And in any case, many people said, you shouldn't believe in God because you're from Northern Ireland, and secondly, you shouldn't believe in God because you're a mathematician. And so the whole question of whether science sat neutrally in the worldview scene, or pointed towards atheism, as Richard Dawkins would suggest, or pointed towards my own theistic Christian faith, as I would suggest, those were questions in their infancy. And as I began to think about them, I was beginning to discover an overarching purpose for my life. In a sense, it was a quest to answer the big questions, the worldview questions, the questions that shape our lives and we think about in school, university, and later on. What is the meaning of life? Is there a purpose? Is there objective reality? What is ultimate reality? Is death the end? Is there a future? And that latter is important. Because, of course, purpose means that you're talking about the future by definition. You don't purpose to do what you're doing now. You are all people of purpose. Look at you sitting here. When did you decide to come? Well, before you came, obviously. No one actually logically can live in the present. You live, for the present. You live in the present. But you live for a future. And it was early on very clear to me that I wanted to research the parameters that define the future, get it into the biggest possible scope, so that I could relate all the various aspects of my life to it. So I see purposes as of different sizes. Limited purposes. I find myself to be an animal that likes to eat. And so tonight I had a lovely meal before coming here. And that purpose satisfied me aesthetically. It was beautifully arranged. So it satisfied another aspect of my person. I find myself to be an aesthetic being. But of course there are longer term purposes. You've probably got a 3-year one or a 4-year one sitting here, haven't you? To get your degree at the end and nobly to defeat the examiners in this university. And then you'll have another purpose, to get a career, to get a job. And then maybe you want to buy a house and a car and a yacht, and you need money for that, and so on. And maybe in the end you will have children. And then you want to send them to school. To do what? To get to Groningen University. To do what? To get a degree. To do what? Well, to be able to get a good job and get a house. And the ancient Greeks were interested in this. The cycle seems to go round. And they started to ask themselves, was there such a thing as a summum bonum? That is something that you aimed at that was simply not merely a means to another end, like getting a degree, to get a job, to get a house, to get money. Is there something overarching? Now, not that there's anything wrong with these purposes. They're very important. And so we have to distinguish between them, and therefore we will find that there's a broad swathe of purposes over which we can agree. Food, for instance. The satisfaction of the basic physical needs that we find ourselves as humans capable of. But then things begin to differ at the higher level of the meta-narrative. What is the big picture, or is there one, into which my life's purposes can be fitted? Let me put it this way. The ancient Greeks were brilliant. I love reading their stuff. They asked big questions. What is this made of? And then they thought, well, that's not a big enough question. What's it made for? And Aristotle, of course, was interested in 4 aspects of this, but I'm only going to think of 2. What's it made of? And suppose one morning you woke up and outside your flat or your dorm, there was a beautiful Jeep sitting, brand new. And there were keys in it. And there it sits. And it sits for 2 or 3 days until you get curious and get in and drive it around. Nobody stops you. And then you start to ask questions. Science can tell you what it's made of. And in a sense you know what it's made for, but was it made for you? Can you drive it where you want? Did it come from a donor, or did it just appear by magic? And you'll ask all kinds of questions about it. And it's interesting, you know, because in the end, we find ourselves equipped with a magnificent piece of physical and biological engineering. And if we don't accede to the thesis that we are our brains, then we've got minds. And here I am, sitting inside this intrinsic and infinitely exquisite and complex human body with all its facilities. I can study what it's made of. But what's it made for? Is it made for anything? Now that, to my mind, is a very important question to ask. And you see, it's here, again, I've got to be personal, because I want to share with you the things that I feel answered my questions gradually and still do. I might tell you that I was so interested in alternative worldviews that I learned German so that I could mix freely in the German Democratic Republic during the Cold War. I then learned Russian to do the same thing in the Russian Academy of Sciences, interested in seeing what atheism does as a meta-narrative to a society. So what happened in Cambridge in those early days has driven me for all of my life. And it has actually been a very large part of my overarching purpose. But there have been lesser purposes, of course. I'm married, I've got 3 children, 7 grandchildren, I've got a home, I'm interested in mathematics, I found purpose in that. But the big question, the overarching purpose, was that in the end I came back to a very old story which fascinates me. When you ask what is life in the sense of what makes life life, there's a story in the first book of the Bible that talks about this. Now, I'm not going to tonight discuss the level of its literature, that's another matter. But its content, the questions it raises, it talks about the fact that human beings have first of all a material base. The way it's put there is God made human beings of the dust of the ground. There's so and so much material. But they're more than that. God made the trees to grow, pleasant to the sight and good for food. That's a very important part of life's purpose for many people. Food, as you can see from the geometry of some people, forms a very large part of purpose. But leaving that aside, we usually impose an aesthetic discipline because we find we are creatures capable of recognizing and admiring beauty. That, for many people, let's leave aside those for whom eating is the major purpose in life, and let's think of people for whom aesthetics is the purpose in life. Collecting a wonderful collection of paintings, getting the latest Picasso or the Fabergé egg or something like this. That fills many people's horizons. And when I began to study, what I began to think, realize as I read this ancient narrative was that the Bible actually says more than most philosophies, not less. Hedonism has us going after pleasure and the satisfaction of our aesthetic sense. But there's more here. We're told a river flowed out of the Garden of Eden. And it divided and it became 4 rivers. And if you follow them down, you find gold. What's all that about? Well, it's simple language, ladies and gentlemen, but don't miss its profundity. It's raising the question of human curiosity, surely. When I see a river or a railway line, I always ask, where is it going? Well, if you follow it, you'll discover that there's minerals there, and actually you can develop them. That forms a large part of many of my colleagues' lives' purpose in Oxford. Following the rivers, following the streams of imagination and doing research. That's fascinating stuff. Is that all there is to life? No, there's much more. Because we're told that human beings were put by God into a garden to look after it. They were given work. Work is part of life. And many people find it fulfills all they feel they need for purpose. So what have we got? A material base, food, aesthetics, curiosity and research, work. Is there anything more to that? Yes. There's relationship. God created man and woman. And what else is there? Well, there's another thing in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Human beings are moral beings. And now comes the interesting thing. Their morality is determined vertically first. Their relationship with God. So, when I'm asked about purpose, you see, this paradigm is in my mind because I believe it to be true. And we will have the opportunity later, I'm sure, I'm going to be grilled. In fact, I'm going to be dragged, according to this missive, into some kind of maelstrom of questions, and I look forward to it. But it's important that I set out in front of you what I believe to be the case, that human beings are made for something. And there are all kinds of limited things which we can share, but the overarching meta-narrative is we're made for the glory of an infinite creator who has dignified us with something utterly unique. He has made us in his own image. That is, of course, the foundation of Western morality and the dignity of man. Made in the image of God. He's a creator. We are creative. And I'm sure many of you are in literature, the arts, and musicology, mathematics, and all the other sciences. And in that ancient book, you get the mandate to do science. God says, go and name the animals. Taxonomy is the foundation discipline of every academic subject. You know words I don't know. I know words you don't know. That's true, isn't it? And so it's so interesting to see that the mandate for doing that comes from the Bible. Now the final point. And this raises the big issues. What about the future? Now here the worldviews divide. Materialism tells me that eventually the matter of my body will disappear and I will cease to be. I believe that there is a supernatural God who, because he raised Christ from the dead, will eventually raise me. And therefore my future, my purposes in this life don't come to an end with my death, but they flow on into a wonderful and unimaginably wonderful future. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.